Feminism, Islam, and the gender wars. Does feminism agree with Islam? Does Islam agree with feminism? Why is this ideology so attractive in the first place? So, there's a lot of reactionary takes on this issue of feminism versus Islam, and should Muslim women embrace this ideology, or even while I think the issue is complicated, I think it's important that we do sort of slow down and start with the basics and ask ourselves what we are for and what we are against. I would agree with anyone who says that Islam doesn't need an outside ideology, that Islam is self sufficient. It is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. However, when we are looking at various ideologies and saying whether we are for or against it, it's only right, it's only the intelligent approach to actually look at the ideology itself, to look at its various characteristics and definitions and what it has put forth, to look at the context of what it has come from, where has this ideology, what's the context around it that sort of birthed this ideology into the world. So whether or not we are for it or against it, we understand it. We understand when it's appropriate, if it's appropriate for others, if it's valuable for others, and if there are things from it that may speak to this society in particular that even we as Muslims can find of value. So I want to start from what Islam is trying to preserve, because I think it's important that if we believe or if we are asking ourselves whether or not feminism is eroding any Islamic values, that we should ask ourselves, what are Islamic values? At least what are some of them? What are the ones that Islam is trying to preserve? So Islam, it's very important that it preserves the rights of men and of women, and also not just rights but responsibilities. And then we look at modern ideologies and we ask, what is it trying to do? So Islam is not primarily about politics, it's certainly not about culture. Islam is a moral system, and classical scholars tell us that it is here to preserve religion, life, reason, family, lineage, and wealth. And the guiding principles include things like harm must be removed, hardship must be alleviated, certainty is not overturned by doubt, and customs carry legal weight. So, this is important because when we talk about feminism, feminism is often viewed as, actually, well, I think we'll get to it, but we are talking about equality between the sexes, and we are talking about rights and responsibilities. And so we can compare what rights and responsibilities is Islam trying to promote and preserve, and what rights and responsibilities is feminism trying to promote and preserve. So, of course, Islamic values come from the Quran and they come from the Sunnah and scholarly tradition. So, Islam does not reinvent itself based on any given culture, even though Islam respects any culture that it is brought into. Islam doesn't say away with every aspect of your culture, but rather Islam comes to purify everywhere that it goes. So, what is feminism? Feminism is not simply caring about women, which I think can be a problematic usage of the word that sometimes we don't realize we're using it. So, if someone says they're not feminist, we often assume, oh, you don't care about women, you don't care about women's rights. Um, but that's not what feminism is, right? Feminism is an ideology, it's more complicated than that, and it has a definition. So, feminism is an ideology, a cultural and political framework rooted in a very specific history. It's one reason why I don't love when people say, I've heard someone say once the Prophet Muhammad SAW was a feminist, or Muslim women were feminists in XYZ generation. And I think it's problematic, not purely based on ideology, because sure, we can say there's some aspects of the religion that, if we talk about feminism in the loose sense of female empowerment, that are in agreement, but more so because it is sort of putting upon a culture something that it didn't put upon itself, right? Feminism comes from a place, from a time, from a culture. So to then go back into a time and a culture before feminism existed and to say those people were feminists, it doesn't seem fair or just to me. Those people are not being allowed to speak for themselves as to whether or not they would agree with the ideology of feminists, or call themselves that. So, at its core, feminism is organized around equality between the sexes, political and social parity, and individual autonomy as the highest good. So, the question is not about does Islam care about women, right? If we say no, Islam is not feminist, we're not saying Islam doesn't care about women. And if we say yes, Islam is feminist, we're certainly not saying that Islam cares about the ideology of feminists. Um, that's sort of a different discussion that we're not at yet. But essentially, if we said the latter, if we said Islam is feminist, we would then have to be saying that there are certain aspects of feminists that Islam agrees with. Again, I don't think that's it's an appropriate way to position it. But if it's just to put it in the best interpretation, that's what we would someone would be saying if they said that. Does Islam measure justice the same way feminism does? Of course, the answer is no, because Islam does not begin with this idea of equality. And of course, Islam came way before feminism existed. Islam is about moral responsibilities. Of course, Islam is about far more than that. But in this discussion, we can focus on moral responsibility. So, equality is not inherently a goal. And we have to be careful because often we hear equality and we think good. We think equality is good. And so if someone says, well, I don't believe in equality, it inherently sounds like you are immoral, that you don't believe in this thing that has this absolute good. And that's not fair and that's not right. Not all things are equal. Not all things should be judged equally. And so, equality in what? Men and women, it depends on the issue. Sometimes we have different roles. Sometimes we have the same roles as believers in our faith towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and our submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's equal. We have the same role. But in a marriage, for example, men and women have different roles. But even between a mother and her son, they have different roles. A father and his daughter, they have different roles, right? It depends on what roles, particularly what social role is the man or woman taking up in a particular society, a particular relationship, and then that better speaks to what are the rights and responsibilities that that person has to um, that belong to that person. So the one example I'm going to give, and this will be a multi-part series, the one example I want to give, at least in this video, is the right to work versus the right to work. So in feminism, there was obviously a distinct movement for women to work. Feminists fought for a lot of things. That's one of the things that they fought for in at least the American context was the right to work. Now, Islam granted women financial independence, but Islam also preserved something that feminism quietly erased. And this is not something you'll hear people talk about very often, but that is the right to not work, right? In American society, women do not have the right to not work. Whereas in Islam, women have the right to not work, especially if we're talking about in a marital situation. And this is important, right? I've spoken about this a lot on my blog, bythefingtheolive.com. There's one essay I have on the economic pressures for women to work. A lot of women would rather not work, right? Especially mothers with children. Not a lot of women want to work, but a lot of women would love the right to not work because of their responsibility over children and various other things. There's sexual harassment in the workplace. Women often make less money than men. So there are a lot of women that would not necessarily like to work, but you don't see any large scale movement for women to have the right to not work. There are some cultural around cultural beliefs and more traditional sectors that women shouldn't work. But even then, you go to the other spectrum, right? Whereas Islam says women have the right to not work, and women also have the right to have financial independence. Now, there's more details around both of those issues that we won't get into now. But this is where I want to leave here. For you, do you know much about feminism? Do you identify with feminism? And do you feel like it's something that is valuable to Muslim women? Do you think that it's more of a mistake in Western society, that's brought more harm than good? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your opinion, and we'll be back with another video on or several more videos on this topic. It won't be back to back, but I just wanted to introduce this issue of feminism and Islam. Thanks so much for listening. Take care.